Spore is this really epic journey from cellular life all the way to spacefaring race.
Spore ultimately is the most creative tool and game that you'll have ever played.
Spore is fundamentally a game where the user creates the world that they experience.
I think of Spore as representing the broadest possible perspective on life.
Spore is many things.
Spore is explosive.
Imagination. Revolutionary.
A lot of creativity.
Spore is awesome.
A surprise.
Imagination.
Community infrastructure.
So big. Creativity.
It's always surprising.
Spore is evolution.
Sharing.
It's imagination.
It's fun.
Enormous.
It's enormous.
Powerful slightly.
It's exciting. Cool. It's a blast. A lot of fun.
An experiment.
My family.
Massive. It's awesome. Huge.
Creative.
It's everything.
Right now, sport's crazy.
Will had been asked to write a piece for Wired magazine, just come up with a game concept, I think they asked him to do. Basically, he used that as an opportunity to write down the idea for Spore, but this is well before it had been percolated through the studio or through EA. But it was this idea of a game where you evolve a society from its very early beginnings into space.
I'd finished up SimCity 3000. I was art directing that, and Will had finished up the first cut at The Sims 1. We were at a kind of a little party afterwards, and I said, "So Will, you finished up The Sims. You've done a game about people, and what are you going to do next?" And Will said, "Well, he had an idea about a game that would be about everything else," and I thought he was joking.
And it literally meant everything. He's working on the entire world, the entire galaxy in a box. So yeah, they didn't undersell it at all.
When we first started on Spore, I was initially calling it Sim Everything, but there was, we'd been using Sim titles for all of our games, and it was kind of like the idea of doing something that didn't have Sim in front of it.
And we wanted a good secret name for the project so that we could have our little secret clubhouse where we referred to it by its secret word, and we'd be the only ones who would know.
And Ocean just kind of threw out Spore. Let's call it Spore. And so that was our code name for the project for a long time. Spore kind of has this connotation. First of all, it sounds like it's about life. It sounds like it's something that wants to spread, and as you're making stuff in the game, it's spreading to all the other players. And really, the game, in some sense, is about life. It's looking at the universe. But the interesting thing about Spore is the way life profoundly affects this fairly mechanistic clockwork universe.
Will's kind of unique in terms of how he really starts to work on a new concept. He does a tremendous amount of reading. In the case of Spore, he's had a lifelong fascination with space, with science. He does a tremendous amount of reading in that territory. And while we were finishing up The Sims Online, he was already having this inkling of an idea of where he wanted to go next.
I'd always been very interested since a kid in astronomy, and I'd never done a space game before. And in particular, I love the idea of this entire galaxy, that I could explore, that would have this, just wonderful variety of worlds from the very, very small microscopic up to the very large kind of intergalactic.
The development team on Spore has really gone through, different phases. It was an extremely small team for a long time, working just with Will. That was really kind of Will just forming up his ideas.
He had a bunch of interns working with him, and basically they were making a bunch of really fun, interesting prototypes that would explore this gameplay for this other idea he had. But they were kind of like the mad scientists in the backgrounds.
And they were basically just trying a lot of things and trying to gel what the actual complete concept of Spore could be, and convince themselves also that we could actually make that game.
I think there was really kind of two battles here. What was the game design in terms of how we're bringing together player content and creativity, but the other side is how do we make the theme of the game, the presentation of it, seem like a universal theme that anybody would feel like they would want to play.
Our first task was to look at this broad notion of Spore and try to map it down into something that we thought was possible. One way of conceiving of making games is the designer has this very clear idea in their head of exactly what they want. They tell you, you go make it. This is not at all how Spore was made.
You know, you didn't really see them making a lot of game, but you'd be able to go over and see that they were having fun and they were, you know, really just exploring the possibility space of what they could create.
They basically made a series of smaller prototypes, really, really small pieces, like a little evolution sim, a gravitational simulator of a solar system, a gravitational simulator of a galaxy. They'd made all these things in OpenGL as separate applications, and they'd sort of glued it all together into one monstrosity of a powers of 10. So you could just start out at the single-celled organism, just keep wheeling, you know, using the mouse wheel and keep pulling back and pulling back and pulling back. We were totally a skunkworks project. Like, no one outside of Maxis knew a damn thing about Spore. So our reveal, the place where we went from being no one had ever heard of Spore to everybody was really wanting it, was at GDC.
It was a packed audience, and Will hadn't told them what the presentation was going to be about.
I'd like to start by also apologizing for the title of this talk and the description.
Or he actually had a name for the presentation, but it had absolutely nothing to do with what he ultimately showed.
This year when they asked me what I was going to talk about, I just flat out lied.
It was something obscure like the future of creativity in games, or it was the future of content.
So I'm not really going to talk about the future of content.
What he showed was a rough demo of Spore.
Sitting in that room, it was at the Game Developers Conference, and watching the crowd and hearing the crowd react to the first time they saw Spore absolutely sent chills down my spine.
Once he had shown, you know, going from one level to the next, going from cell to creature and then to tribe, and as he kept zooming out, you could hear audible gasps.
As one, they took a breath and went,
He pulls back from the planet and like goes to visit another planet and like blows up the planet, and like the guy in the row in front of us stands up and starts bowing.
You know, people got on their feet, gave him like a 5-minute standing ovation because the idea was just so startling and fresh, and they all got it.
It was complete mayhem. We had people coming up to us going, "Are you really making that?"
Everybody was pretty much thinking, oh, they're almost done, great, we'll be seeing this in a few years. But I mean, that demo is built around a couple strong pieces of technology we had, and you know, Will is a wizard when it comes to the demo.
So like the whole purpose of that demo was to communicate what Spore was, both to us and to our future players, and to the EA executive.
So I remember the first time I actually pitched Spore to the EA execs. And so I kind of came in, I had some slides, and I kind of went through my 15-20-minute spiel about how cool Spore is going to be and why. And I could see on everybody's faces that they just had no idea what I was talking about. I mean, you know, I'm not even sure I did.
You don't work for Will Wright, you work with Will Wright.
First of all, he is really jaw-droppingly, amazingly smart and inventive and creative. He just thinks about things differently. He's always the person in the room who's going to ask the question that comes kind of out of left field.
You go to lunch with Will and like you have no idea what you're going to end up talking about by the end of lunch. It's, you know, it's robots, it's the Soviet space program, it's, you know, whatever the napkin's made out of.
When you work with him, you go through really different stages. And when he starts a game or a new concept, or, you know, he really takes sort of this world system, and he's done this a number of times, cities, people, ants, and he's kind of broken them down into these mechanics and then put them back together in a way that people can really interact with. They become toys. The game team itself didn't kick off until we really hired in some people, and it was all about engaging in the core technologies.
So the core team was, when I got here, was mostly engineers. I think a lot of our technology was in pretty serious development at that time, and I think we had more engineers than any other game developer. We had a lot of designers that also could code, which was really, you know, amazing, because like a designer could come up with an idea for a prototype and then go, you know, turn something out to show their idea to everyone to see if it held water, if it was going to be something we'd want to use.
The way our team is structured is we have a lot of very talented people, and we've tried as much as possible to distribute the design decisions down through the whole team. So just about anybody on the team is free to kind of jump into a design discussion and offer their opinion or alternative.
Some of the emphasis of Spore is all about tapping into player creativity. Our position was we wanted players to be as creative as they possibly could. The creators, where they get to make their own creatures or their buildings or vehicles, are all about tapping into that player creativity and giving them no constraints.
Most people, they might have a little bit of experience moving through a 3D world in a game, but in terms of actually creating 3D assets, that was something that we basically had to make seem not only easy to use, but actually fun.
Our sort of fundamental editors are the creature editor, putting parts on a creature, and we have the building editor making structures, and the vehicle editor. The creature editor was a really tight collaboration with the artist in saying, hey, we're going to have this body, we're going to have bones, you can stick like a shoulder or an elbow, and we got to figure out, what do we put on this?
In a typical video game, most characters are created in Maya or some other similar application by an artist. Characters usually have a bunch of like bones and textures and geometry that gets modeled over the process of a few days or a week. And what we do is compress that whole experience down into a few clicks of the mouse.
The idea was, they wanted to go from 0 to smile in 3 clicks.
The system that we've created in Spore lets a player that's never created anything like that before create it in just minutes.
When we first started letting players make creatures, we realized that they were having more trouble than I expected them to have with limbs. So we realized we needed to make a palette of limbs.
If you look at the creatures that we've got now in our creature editor, there's a lot of structure to them. So instead of having an individual section of bone that you have to create a whole creature out of, there's pre-assembled limbs, and you can grab a whole limb, and the system knows what a limb is.
When you see a player who's never used the editor before, they go in and they want to put an arm on the creature, they can.
Yeah, we had to be quite careful about how we picked the individual parts so that when the player put them together, you always got like a unified look.
There was like a really tight back and forth with the artist. For instance, on the parts we have the handles which you can form them, and that came from the art side saying, hey look, we're going to be making these parts in Maya, and an artist is going to make them, but we still want the player to have control over them.
A classic example of a problem that we had with the editors was, like in the creature editor, there's this torso, there's this sort of blob that you're putting legs and arms onto. Well, we had the problem of how do you manipulate that? How do you move it around? And so I remember one day we were talking about this, and I said, the spine should be just like my belt. And I whipped my belt off and I slapped it down on the table. And I'm like, well, it should be like this. You grab a part of the belt and you move it around. Like that kind of physical analogy then became the basis for how the spine works. So now you grab the spine and you can drag it around, you middle mouse wheel to make it wider and thicker.
I actually had my mom try the editors, and there were certain things that definitely confused her, and there were certain things that she understood. But it was good user testing experience, because if your mom gets something, then you know that it's right.
We knew that it would be a real game when we were able to create the first real character, when we were able to basically make something that looked like a professional 3D modeled character that had a real presence and was textured and moved around. The moment that we first brought a creature to life, in a sense, it was sort of a Dr. Frankenstein moment, when you said it's alive.
One of the challenges of Spore was keeping the player connected to their creature throughout the game.
When you add a part to a creature, it'll sort of realize that you've added this part, and what that does is it brings the creature to life and it gives it emotion, so that if you pull its arm off and it kind of hangs its head and it's sad, you kind of feel for it, you want to put the arm back on. Or when you put a new mouth on the creature and it sort of tries it out and does a roar, you really can relate to it a lot more. That brings an emotional element to it.
So not only is the player customizing the way their creature looks or the way their spaceship looks, but they're molding their creature's experience by how they play the game. Every choice that they make can have effects in later levels. How you decide to befriend a tribe or conquer a tribe makes an impact on what abilities you'll have in space.
Essentially everything that you can do, so whether the way you fight, the way you socialize, the way you eat, is all defined by the parts that you had. So if you put a carnivorous mouth on, you have to eat meat. If you put a herbivorous mouth on, you have to eat fruit. And I think that's the heart and soul of creature game, this idea that I made something and now my game changes because of the way I made my creature. I think that's a much stronger game and a much more interesting thing to build than to just say, I have predefined things I can do and I can make something that looks different.
The editors are the thing that we have spent the most effort getting to be perfect. I mean, we've been doing user testing on those for the last 4 years. That kind of, it just feels effortless, is the result of just constant polish and iteration and improvement.
As we get into the technology stuff, I had to have some very serious programmers that could go in and solve fundamental problems that had not been solved before. Chris Hecker was brought in to work on the animation system, which probably was the single hardest technical problem we faced in Spore. We did a lot of research finding out what the state of the art in this was, and there was very, very little work in this actually. And I think we've probably advanced the state of the art by several years in procedural animation.
I think that the easiest way to describe what proceduralism in the sense that Spore means it is we have to teach the computer how to do something. With Spore, the things that we save out onto the DVD that you install on your computer are not these fixed recipes anymore. They're kind of lessons for the computer to learn how to do the thing itself in some very hand-wavy sort of way.
There's a whole pipeline under the hood. In most games you have thousands and thousands of dollars worth of artists' tools. The artists use those tools and they manually get all the content, from the 3D authoring app into the game. There's engineers who are responsible for shepherding that data through at every stage, and it's a big part of making a game. In contrast, in a game like Spore, all that stuff has to take place automatically and on the fly, internally inside the game. We have to be able to build the geography of the world, the terrain, the oceans and the mountain ranges, and we have about half a second to build that world. And we have to build all the buildings and vehicles. We have to populate the whole world with the creatures. That might take another couple of seconds. So we've got, maybe 8 seconds, maybe 10 seconds to go from nothing to a world with weather and plants and cities and vehicles driving around and creatures living on it. So we've got these tiny little recipes for creating a building. So when the player creates a building, what they're really doing is they're writing a recipe for creating a building. And the recipe gets sent to everyone else who's playing the game. So the player in the background downloads a recipe for a creature, and then we have to reconstitute that recipe as a creature at the level where the player needs to see it in, half a second or a second or so.
We were taking script, so we were creating worlds and planets using text, basically. It seems really primitive, but what it allowed us to do was do things with very little data. So you could essentially, by writing a script, you could sort of direct our particle system into constructing